Hi, my name is Rosalyn Negrón. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'm going to walk you through the basics of discourse analysis. Now, this is targeted at anthropologists, but the framework that I'm going to present really applies across disciplines. The main goal of discourse analysis is to study language in action and in context, and it's suitable for a range of research questions when the heart of the matter is to understand how people build the world through their discourse, how language itself is a vehicle for constructing the social world and for maintaining social life. Through discourse analysis, we understand what people do with language to accomplish various social and communicative goals. And I'll share a secret about me. I don't have formal training in discourse analysis. Nearly all I know about this method I taught myself through reading and practicing while doing my dissertation research and in talking with other language scholars about it. For my cultural anthropology dissertation, I was interested in how Latinos in highly diverse neighborhoods in Queens, New York, used language to invoke multiple ethnic identities across contexts. I understood early on that language was going to be a key way that folks actually did this. And so I collected hundreds of hours of naturally occurring conversation for my dissertation research. I actually dug into the data and I taught myself these methods. So I share this to be encouraging to you. If you have access to courses, get the training, but you don't need extensive formal training in linguistics to use these methods. Now let's get started. You may wonder how to make sense of this, which visualizes the complexity of discourse analysis. There's a lot going on here, so I encourage you to return to this for a closer look. Discourse analysis pulls from multiple disciplines. Early on, it was anthropology, linguistics, and philosophy. In the early 1970s, it began to develop as a discipline unto itself, and there were developments from Europe and the United States that continue to today as part of the umbrella of discourse analysis. I'd like to point out here that early influence of anthropology in the development of discourse analysis. Ethnography of speaking is a case in point, which was developed by Delheims in the 1960s. Ethnography of speaking was about understanding communication in social and cultural contexts. Therefore, ethnographic methods were important for understanding language practices. This was about language in action, not so much language in terms of its formal structures, but how it's actually used by members of a speech community. So, to summarize, discourse analysis is an interdisciplinary field. There are multiple approaches to it, and it's pulling together different theories and different assumptions about language and about social practice. What do we mean by discourse, anyways? This is another aspect of the field's complexity. Not only are there different approaches to doing discourse analysis, but there are also different ways that discourse itself is defined. One definition is that discourse is any meaning that's beyond the sentence level. If you think about the structure of language, we can start with the very smallest units of sound, which we build with to create words, which are the building blocks of sentences. Each of these building blocks have meaning. But one way to think about discourse is that it's the meaning that happens beyond the sentence level. Discourse analysis encompasses those features of language, but goes beyond them. Others define discourse in a Foucauldian sense, which brings attention to the way that discourse is a system of both linguistic and non-linguistic social practices, ideologies, and importantly, power relations that have a world-making role. In this short introduction, we're going to be focusing on that definition of discourse that is about the study of language in use, language in action. So let's get into it. I'm going to break down a few steps, but it assumes that you have already collected data or that you have some other data to work with. With discourse analysis, you can work with pre-existing texts from secondary sources. For example, you can use text from a speech, or you can analyze discourse from a television show or an interview or an oral history narrative. You don't necessarily have to collect data. It really depends on your research project and your research questions. Assuming that you have already selected a text for analysis, the first step is to establish the context. What we mean by establishing the context will vary depending on the nature of your data. If you're working with secondary data sources, let's say something that you pulled from an archive or from a recording of a speech, and it's not something that you collected yourself, make sure you take time to understand the social and historical context of its production. Now, if you are working with data that you've collected yourself, here is where you're pulling on field notes, your interviews, your historical sources, and other materials that you have brought into your ethnographic study in order to, again, situate this text within a social and historical context. This background information often becomes present in the text itself, and you need to be able to recognize it and draw from it as you do the analysis. Before you can get started with discourse analysis, you need a transcript. If you're working with secondary data sources, this may already be available to you. Assuming your research question calls for analysis of spoken discourse, a first step in the process is to take this spoken discourse and get a written form that you can work with. This step is crucial and requires a lot of care, so it takes time. The purpose of the transcription is to take the spoken discourse and try to render it as closely as possible to what it might sound like if you were listening to somebody speaking. For example, see here this convention of the question mark. This marks a rising intonation, which is the rise in voice pitch that we associate with a question. In a discourse analysis transcript, a period marks falling intonation, which, at least in English, is the fall of voice pitch that signals the end of a sentence. If someone is saying something loudly or is putting an emphasis on a word, we want to be able to mark that to then understand how the emphasis is actually getting something done in that particular interaction. Depending on the nature of the analysis that you're doing, you may need to be more or less detailed with your transcription. These are just some examples of the things that you might be able to mark in text. If you were to be doing, for example, a conversation analysis, you would have many other markers in a transcription than what I show here. Now, this next step may be familiar to many because it's the broad sketch of a thematic analysis, a conventional sort of qualitative data analysis that we might do with, say, interview texts. In discourse analysis, this phase may not be as in-depth as what you might do with thematic coding of multiple interviews, but it's an important step. Initially, it's reading and note-taking. Then you turn to coding, which will help you identify sequences of discourse that you can look into more closely because they touch on themes that are central to your research questions. In the case of my own dissertation study, the central questions were about ethnic identity invocation. One of the things that people might do is invoke their identity to forge a relationship that might prove advantageous for economic reasons, such as for getting a job or for making a sale. And so I would make sure to pull out examples of this theme, let's call it economic advantages, through this thematic coding process, and look for patterns across different instances. The instances could be for one person, or they could be across different people. Identifying these patterns through the coding process will also help interpretation in later phases. Now, asking questions of the text is at the heart of discourse analysis. There are many different questions that you can ask of the text. They may vary depending on which approach to discourse analysis you're pursuing, whether it's a critical discourse analysis where you're attending to questions of power, or whether you're doing a conversation analysis involving a microanalytic analysis that pays attention to things like sequence of turn-taking within an interaction. What I present here is from James Allen G's work, and I find his to be a really useful framework. This framework has a set of what G calls building tasks, which are things that people do with discourse to build reality. For each of these building tasks, there are 6 inquiry tools that we can deploy in our analysis. In other words, 6 different questions we can ask of the text about each of the 7 building tasks. Let me just quickly go over the 6 inquiry tools. The first one is situated meaning, and this has to do with the context. This is the idea that different features of language or different languages can take on different meanings depending on the context. We could ask, what is it about the context that can help to make sense of what the speaker is doing? Next, we have social languages. The idea being that people have available to them a repertoire of different styles and varieties of a language. For example, a formal style of English and a casual or vernacular form. And so you want to recognize these different social languages when their use might be signaling, for example, different social identities, as was the case in my own research. Then we have figured worlds. A way to think about figured worlds is as cultural models. These are often unconscious, taken for granted understandings of the world that facilitate people's daily lives. Here we might ask, what shared cultural knowledge is necessary to have in order to make sense of an utterance? Next, we have intertextuality, and this is the idea that sometimes when we say something, we're calling forth, connecting to, or maybe even directly quoting something that someone else has already said or written. People may do this to shape the meaning of what they're trying to say in the moment. Next, we have what G calls discourses with a capital D. This is the idea that how we talk and act can be part of an identity kit, so to speak. So we use to take on a role or signal our membership in a social group. And finally, we have big C conversations. Here, G is pointing to those discussions or debate in society about things like climate change or race. These conversations are often in the background of the things that people say and can therefore be used to make sense of people's discourse and the sorts of values or orientations they want to communicate about themselves. So the idea is to take each of these tools to generate questions that you can ask about the identities, the politics, the relationships, and so on that are being built with language. You will eventually reach a point in your analysis when you're ready to bring everything together. And by everything, we mean the fine-grained analysis of the text itself and the layers of interpretation of the discursive practices in play or what's being done with language. For example, the sorts of positions that people are taking in relation to others in an interaction, the identities that are invoked, or the power dynamics that are present in the interaction. Once we've done a fine-grained analysis of a stretch of discourse, we might do this again across various samples of text. We'll then bring it to a point where we're linking across text to say something more general about social practice in a given community. For example, I found that people were most flexible with the different ethnic categories that they used when there were real economic resources at stake. That's a sociological conclusion that I came to reading across different texts of different people's interactions. Texts that I had gone through carefully to analyze discourse at the utterance level, looking at things like switching between dialects, intonation, use of idioms, grammar, in addition to the words that people said. Now, while I've sketched out a sequence that moved from contextual analysis to textual analysis, in practice, you're going to be moving across these layers as you do your work. In other words, discourse analysis is an iterative process. You might, let's say, do a sociological analysis, which might lead you back to an analysis of the context in which a speech was produced to see how what you're learning deepens or changes your understanding of the context. And this means that there's a certain analytical nimbleness that's required in doing discourse analysis. It's useful to think of discourse analysis as a mentality rather than just a method. I'll add a final note here. I started by saying that I did not have formal training in discourse analysis, and that includes not taking linguistic analysis courses. But of course, linguistics is really important. For example, grammatical analysis is important to discourse analysis, and if you come to discourse analysis without a formal training, it might be easy to overlook the importance of grammar for making interpretations of a text. Here's an example from G that highlights the importance of understanding what a subject is. In the first one, Mary Washington is the subject. In the second one, Sarah is the subject. And so a question to ask yourself is, why did the speaker choose Mary Washington to be the subject or the topic of that statement and not Sarah? What is the speaker trying to tell us about, for example, the relationship between Mary Washington and Sarah, or the speaker's own orientation to either Mary Washington or Sarah? To some, Discourse analysis is an interdisciplinary field that's used to study language and action. It's about understanding how people make things happen through language. Since its beginnings in the 60s, discourse analysis has grown incredibly and today encompasses many different approaches. There continues to be opportunities and possibilities for innovation. For example, consider how these methods might work if you were studying online social interaction. Or consider this image here, which could be studied using discourse analysis. You might consider this to be a multimodal discourse analysis. To analyze this image, we can ask questions about context, intertextuality, identity, and politics. How might you apply the steps that you've learned to the analysis of the scene? Consider how discourse analysis might be useful to your work, even if, and perhaps especially if, you're not actually looking specifically at talk in your own project.